It's difficult to take care of someone with dementia. That's probably a given. Especially, but not exclusively, if you're in a home setting. But without details, saying that it's difficult, as obvious as that is simply a platitude. And many factors, for example, about your loved one, about you, and about the home environment, can make a tremendous difference. So in this video, I want to draw from my own experiences as a caretaker for my dad, as well as my own research, and zoom in on some of the complexities involved. The variations are too numerous for me to be exhaustive. I'm not even going to be able to come close to that. Nevertheless, I want to work toward an answer to the question, how hard is it to be an at-home caretaker? I'm going to deliver a few prefatory remarks, but if you want to skip right to the nitty-gritty, I'm going to have in the description a contents thing so that you can actually jump to different timestamps to find the section that most interests you. I assume, at present anyway, that a lot of my viewership has found my videos because something has them stuck. They're already an at-home caretaker or a caregiver in some other capacity, and something has them stuck. And the bulk of my Alzheimer's Proof project is geared toward trying to deliver that help, at least to the extent that I'm capable of. And for example, I've sketched some of these kinds of problems and scenarios in such videos as how hard is it to be a solo caretaker and so on. By the way, you are welcome, more than welcome, to describe your own experiences, your own background. Please give me topic suggestions or ask questions or whatever you would like in the comment section below. And if you would like, you can even email me at alzheimersproof@gmail.com. But recently, I've been getting comments and communications from people who are in a slightly different situation, from people who are already caregivers, they already know how hard it is, and they're reaching out for help. Some of the people are considering becoming caregivers, and they want an accurate or at least realistic picture of just what they're getting themselves into. From where I sit now, having been a caretaker for my dad for some years, my dad passed in 2016, it's painfully obvious to me the kinds of factors that make caregiving difficult. In fact, in some cases, it can be so difficult that it verges on impossible from a practical standpoint. Not least of these is the Alzheimer's disease itself. It's obviously a terrifying affliction, and it can change everything about the person that you love. It can cause emotional disturbances. It can disrupt sleep patterns. It undermines language and cognitive faculties, and so on. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Not only this, but the details of its mechanisms of action are still unknown. In other words, we don't really know what is going on inside the brain of a person that has Alzheimer's. I mean, we have indications and we can say certain things, but we don't have a firm grasp on the causal mechanisms involved. Consequently, there is no intervention that is curative. Put in broadest possible terms, Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia damage the brain. Given enough time, these conditions erode a person's memory and ultimately can destroy their personality. Caretaking for someone with dementia does have points of contact with caretaking for other conditions, such as a person who might have a severe autism, or someone else who might have other behavioral or severe communication problems. But despite these similarities, Alzheimer's has certain unique qualities. And when a person's condition advances far enough, it's like talking to a complete stranger, and possibly a person who is even next to comatose, as my dad was just prior to his passing. But when they behave as a total stranger, and when, frankly, they treat you as if you were a total stranger, caretaking can become very, very difficult. Because, if for no other reason, they can sometimes resist your attempt to care for them, and sometimes they can even get violent. But these drastic changes are not always obvious from the word go. Of course, I will be speaking, as I said, from my own case, the case of my dad. And I'll rewind the clock, so to speak, to the point before I really understood the total depth of what my dad was going through, because the realization of what Alzheimer's can do unfolded for me as a process. And when I first came into my dad's caretaking circle, our family did not have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's yet for my dad. In other words, we didn't really know what we were up against. And furthermore, I didn't think of what I was doing as caretaking per se. I knew my dad needed assistance getting around, assistance remembering things, and that kind of thing. But I assumed that his difficulties were simply just the normal aging process as he was experiencing it, because everybody ages slightly differently, everybody has different physical debilitments that they deal with, cognitive, and I just thought this was the way that the chips were falling for him. So I didn't see, nor did I understand the total picture. You might be wondering, how is that possible? And then again, maybe you know perfectly well how it's possible. The first thing I'll say there is that identifying and diagnosing dementia is not always a straightforward process. For some of the particulars as to why that's the case, I invite you to see my past video, 10 Reasons Alzheimer's Disease is Sometimes Missed. But let me give a Cliff's Notes version of that right now. First of all, there's no one universal test for unfailingly detecting Alzheimer's disease in a living person. Definitive proof is unfortunately left to be discovered during an autopsy, if one is performed. Instead, dementias are usually identified behaviorally. And typically these behavioral discoveries are made by the people closest to the afflicted person, by their family, by their friends. It's a person who knows what they were like before and who can grasp the totality, the severity of the memory problems and the behavioral changes that the person is displaying. Now, my mom was the closest person to my dad for many years and for obvious reasons. But I did have a slight advantage over my mom. Namely, I had been around long enough to know what my dad was like years ago. But I had also been absent for some of the small incremental changes. The devolution that my dad went through was, after all, at first very slow. And it's easy, and my mom certainly did, sort of acclimate herself to those changes so that she got used to his forgetfulness. And as he got more and more forgetful, she sort of lost track of what he had been like before all that started. When I came into the picture, I had been gone from the house for some time. And so for me, the difference was striking. The way my dad had been, the way I remembered him, and the way that he behaved as I came to see him. However, I'm not a healthcare professional, and I had absolutely no contact or experience with Alzheimer's or dementia of any kind prior to my dad. So I wasn't carrying around a checklist of symptoms and then marking them off one after the other when my dad would display each one. At least not at first. In all candor, I didn't even know what those warning signs were. And to be brutally honest, as I admitted in another past video, I just frankly thought my dad was turning into a jerk. Now, I feel horrible about that, and if being a caretaker for someone with Alzheimer's or other dementia has likewise made you feel like an awful person, please see my past video on that very topic. I remembered my dad being an active person. He was always a social butterfly. And I thought perhaps his isolation and the fact that his body wasn't responding to him the way it had before might have just caused a bit of bitterness and caused him to withdraw socially and just be resentful. I suspected that the root was loneliness. My dad was retired, but my mom was still working because there was a 22-year age gap between the two of them. So when I came into the picture, I just thought that my presence would alleviate some of his loneliness. That me just being there would provide someone for him to talk to, someone to interact with, and that would take the edge off of things. I thought his friendliness was still there deep down, and I expected that would just come through with very little effort. Of course, I recognized that he wasn't as capable of getting around as he used to be. And he certainly wasn't maintaining the house like he had done when he was a younger man. But again, I just chalked that up to normal aging. I imagine myself cleaning up the clutter, emptying the gutters, fixing plumbing leaks, lifting heavy items for him, mowing the lawn, and things of that kind. In other words, no big deal really. My dad's finances were in decline, and that's a separate topic, but this was the result of economic downturns, for example, in 2008, with the housing market. So I didn't immediately ask questions about how he was maintaining his finances. Finally, it was obvious to me that his memory wasn't what it used to be. But who among us can say differently? So I thought I would be writing a lot of post-it notes. We got this big oversized calendar, and I thought I would fill entries in there, and that would be an assist. What's the problem? Well, where to begin? I didn't yet appreciate that my dad's personality was literally being affected, being altered by his affliction. Shortly, though, I did see him manifesting all kinds of negative qualities: aggression, depression, obsession, paranoia, you name it. And even though I clearly saw that he needed lots of help, including physical help, he didn't see it. He kept trying to do all the stuff he had done before, except it was unprincipled, it was haphazard, it was more dangerous than it had ever been. So if he saw leaves in the gutter, then there goes this 80-year-old man going to get his extension ladder. And I'm thinking all I can do really is try to usurp it and say, no, I'll take care of it. Is it snowing? Okay, well then there's this octogenarian going to get his snow shovel. So I bought a cheap snowblower just so that I could say to him, you know what, I'm not going to shovel. You don't need to help me. I have this one device. I'll take care of it. Once, when he was still driving, he still had his driver's license, he announced in the middle of a winter storm, snowstorm, ice, whatever it was, that he was going to go take the car to get an oil change in the middle of it. I think it would be wrong to think of what he was doing as rebellious in some way. I think it was just that he connected the idea of being in this winter crisis to the idea of preparedness. And that made him think, I got to make sure that the car is able to go through, the winter season. So get the tires changed, get the oil changed, whatever. He was trying to be helpful, I think. But obviously the reasoning behind that was quite obviously and seriously deficient. And this mismatch between his perceptions and objective reality continually made for conflict. And I hadn't come to grips with the fact that his memory and his reasoning impairments were just two aspects of an overall cognitive impairment that had much broader repercussions. He no longer recognized hazards. So in the home, our only option as caretakers then was to try to remove the hazards or to try to cordon off certain areas to make them off limits. At the same time, he couldn't be reasoned with. It was useless to try to explain to him why we were implementing what we thought were necessary changes. For example, me locking the door to the garage and then locking his tools up in the garage so that if he managed to get through the locked door, he still wouldn't be able to access his power tools. There were many, many changes like this, and he took them very badly. Almost without fail, when he would notice these kinds of restrictions, he would become aggressive, combative, resentful. But he was unable to express himself fully, and so that anger just manifested in just raw aggression, shouting, throwing things, screaming names at us, and so on. Most of the time, they were just direct outbursts directed at whoever was the closest. But when they were indirect, he would just try to sneak away. This is, in caretaking nomenclature, called elopement, when they leave the safety of the care environment without anyone knowing. And several times he was returned to the house by the police. One of the most memorable occasions to me was an early morning knock from a policeman that had discovered him walking along a major street, once again during a snowstorm. He got out of the house so early that I wasn't even awake. I had no idea he had left the house, and this was before I implemented restrictions on the doors themselves. Another time he left during a major heat wave. He just took off, and we had to send out a search party for him, literally. He was found at a local park, just drenched in sweat, and he was okay, but this is the kind of thing that you have to put up with, or you should be expecting to have to deal with if you're the caretaker for someone who has a cognitive impairment. So in my family's case, being a caretaker for my dad, given our personalities, which I'll get to a little bit more in just a second, and given the nature of my dad's affliction, turned out to be extremely hard. But I want to give this a little more care. So let me take a few steps back, because I think it would be a mistake for me to simply declare caretaking is always and everywhere hard and just leave it at that. I think we need to tread very carefully because there are complicating factors. So let's take a look at some of those. The first thing to say is that there is a distinction that needs to be made between objective and subjective judgments. I already touched on this without calling it that, but we can illustrate this fairly starkly with my dad. Objectively, he was unsafe operating a motor vehicle, using power tools, but subjectively, from his own internal perspective, he didn't see any of that. He didn't understand the objective state of affairs. But this distinction applies to everybody involved. So consider a different illustration drawn again from my own extended family situation. My sister has a PhD in behavioral psychology. Intuitively, being a caretaker for my dad would have been easier for her, with scare quotes around that, than it was for me. I mean, some of what you do as a caretaker is to try to calm the person down, to try to redirect them to various other activities. And all this kind of thing would have been part of the purview of her training, but she lived out of state. And the family, for various reasons, didn't really give any consideration to relocating my dad to her. Not least because when you change the living environment for a person with dementia, that change can really set them off. So in my family's case, I only had recourse to my sister as an advisor. In terms of the day-to-day caretaking, I basically had to go it alone, my mom and I. On the other hand, many moons ago, I used to install car alarms, mobile stereos, vehicle remote starters, and so on. And this gave me a general familiarity with tools, which I was then able to leverage into being somewhat handy around the house. So when my family had to reverse the door lock on the front door, or relocate the thermostat, as I've discussed these in other videos, these interventions were easier for me to do than they would have been for my sister. Now, of course, she could have paid to have somebody do those interventions, but you see what I'm getting at. People have different strengths and weaknesses, and that is obviously something you need to think about, reflect on, even inventory seriously before you commit to home care. And that's one aspect of what I mean by subjective factors. How easy or how hard some aspect of caregiving is going to be is partially dependent on your skill set, your experience, and of course, your personality. And let's talk about temperament for a minute. I have a tendency to be irascible. I also tend to be more quote-unquote introverted. My sister, on the other hand, is usually very easygoing and certainly much more extroverted than I am. So even if we were to run our personal histories again and I were to have selected behavioral psychology and she would have selected installing car stereos, it's still possible that once we get into a care scenario, she would still be better suited to be a caretaker than I, just based on her temperament. Maybe it's easier for her to calm my dad down because she's just more even-tempered herself. But of course, caretaking scenarios also have objective features as well. Here I'm referring to what you might call the facts of your situation. These kinds of things will include a total and accurate description, such as it is available to you, of your loved one's condition. What symptoms of dementia are they manifesting? What stage of the condition are they in? And so on. It's also going to include the pros and cons of the care environment. I mean, this could have to do with such banalities as just how many flights of stairs do you need to go through in order to get to the main level? Are there windows all over the place that can be easily opened from the inside, such that if you were to lock the doors, your loved one could still elope by opening a window? Once again, there are too many variations for me to list exhaustively. I'm hoping, though, that something I say might spark your own self-reflection. But let's zoom in just a little more here and talk about one or two of these factors. The most obvious comment to make here is that Alzheimer's is a progressive disease. And just that fact alone is going to make it the case that different care scenarios are going to vary from person to person and from situation to situation. But other factors might cause even one individual person to vary in terms of how they behave from day to day and even from hour to hour. And certainly they'll start to vary month to month and year to year as their condition worsens. But my dad could vary moment to moment. He could be calm one minute and then think he wants to go outside and find that the door lock's reversed and he can't get out, and now all of a sudden he's enraged. And those kinds of emotional flare-ups were just part of our day-to-day experience with him in the caretaking situation we found ourselves in. His combativeness was one of the major symptoms of his particular experience of middle-stage Alzheimer's disease. So how your loved one's dementia manifests also is liable to change. In the earliest stage, they might be very little different affectively in terms of their emotions, rationally in terms of their ability to reason, from the way that they were before they had any cognitive impairment at all. In other words, they might be hard to distinguish. They might seem like their old selves. And this is, of course, in cases where the diagnosis comes very early. This did not happen in our case. But if you find yourself in that kind of caretaking circumstance, then the earliest stage might be very low impact. You might find yourself issuing periodic reminders to your loved one, helping them, for example, to come up with a name, come up with a word, to remember their appointments, to help them pay their bills, and so on. Early stage caregiving usually is not as demanding as caregiving can and will become in later stages. Now, there's an important asterisk on that. Namely, we're ignoring at present cases where your loved one has some other condition in addition to dementia. So if they also have diabetes or cancer or any of a number of other conditions, then caregiving can be complicated right out of the gate, even if their dementia is only in the earliest stages. But that's not a problem that's peculiar to the Alzheimer's. It's simply a function of their overall health picture. But this isn't to say that the earliest stages, even if you're able to catch the dementia in that stage, and even if you do implement caregiving strategies at that point, it's not to say that this is simply pain-free or problem-free. But some of the challenges will come from accepting the diagnosis and planning for the future. Planning in terms of making changes around the house, what I refer to as Alzheimer's proofing, a kind of an analog to child proofing for an expectant family welcoming a newborn into the house. But this will also include changes to finances, making arrangements with the expectation, unfortunately, that their condition will worsen. From a home care standpoint, you're going to want, in other words, to put in place practices and procedures that give you the best chance of being able to continue home care for as long as possible. In the earliest stage, you'll also want to take full advantage, if you can, of your loved one's lucidity and, for example, involve them to the extent that it's possible and warranted in their own decision making. Now here we run into both legal and medical complications. So I can't advise anyone on this. I can simply say you'll want to involve doctors and attorneys in trying to help you make the determination as to how cognitively with it your loved one is. To what extent can they participate in the decision-making processes without legal liabilities and other problems. In the earliest stage as well, you want to make an effort to get your loved one to buy in to the kinds of changes and restrictions that you'll almost certainly have to implement around the house. For example, it's possible, I don't know that this would have worked, but it's possible that if my dad had been present and cognitively with it enough in the earliest stage for him to have agreed that, I needed to reverse the door locks on the front door or lock the power tools up. It's possible that that might have reduced the conflict down the road, But of course, the major wild card is Alzheimer's affects memory. So if they agree to it, on Monday, are they going to remember it on Friday? And of course, I have other videos on the kinds of restrictions that I had to do, as well as how-to guides, if you like, for procedures for things like locking cabinets and doors, removing tools or other dangerous objects, and restricting access to basements, garages, and vehicles. Granted, the value of these preliminary efforts will be offset to a certain extent by the inevitability of your loved one's decline in memory and rationality. That is, even after you've safeguarded the home, and if you've been able to secure their consent for that, they might not remember it. Still, one benefit of this, if you can do it early enough, is that you might acclimate them to a more minimalistic home environment. For example, if one of the possible dangers in your house is that there's just too much clutter, if in early stage you can get them to help you get rid of some things, then by the time you get into the later stages, maybe those things aren't even around anymore. So it's possible that I could have gotten my dad not to agree to lock the tools up, but to agree to get rid of some of them so that they weren't even around. But again, all of this is just guesswork. He might have forgotten that he agreed about that and gotten mad at me for getting rid of his tools. Probably some degree of likelihood that that is exactly what would have happened. But a bigger plus is that, going back to the objective-subjective distinction, is that if you do implement these changes, whether or not they subjectively adhere to any agreements that you made or buy in some subjective sense, that you will nevertheless have objectively made the home environment more care ready and safer than it would have been otherwise. But a major caveat here is that even though detection for dementia is getting better, arguably, it's still by no means the case that you can guarantee that it will be detected in early stage. In other words, a lot of dementia sufferers go undetected until after they've passed through early stage. And that's exactly what happened in my dad's case. I wasn't called upon to step into a caregiving role until it was already more advanced, his cognitive impairment. And when that occurs, you don't have much, if any, time to get ready. You're just thrown into the caretaking role straight away. And this is what happens when you become a caretaker starting off in middle stage. And I don't have statistics, but I have to expect that this is not an uncommon situation. And by middle stage, typically some pretty serious problems have already emerged. Obviously, memory issues become more pronounced. Your loved one might start having extended bouts of aggression, confusion, depression, and panic. They may experience mood swings or other behavioral changes. Communication difficulties can arise, and these are compounded by the overall degradation of their reasoning abilities. As a result of all this, other abilities, such as to drive and to just live by themselves, become seriously undermined. Eventually, of course, if the disease runs its course, these abilities are ultimately completely destroyed. Although there are numerous caveats on all of these things. But from the standpoint of caretaking difficulties, here's a key takeaway. The problems that present themselves in middle stage are often especially trying for home caregivers. Middle stage can even be the most challenging stage of the decline, at least from a home care point of view. These problems will be compounded when a suitable home care environment has not been arranged in advance. You'll have to do all the prep work and safeguarding work while simultaneously delivering care. And unfortunately, it's oftentimes the stage that lasts the longest. Meanwhile, you're confronted with a loved one who might not even be recognizable as the person that you knew. Middle stage can put tremendous pressure on the family, on their resources, on their ability to safeguard the environment, because, as I've explained elsewhere, and as we'll sort of touch on again in just a moment, the person in middle stage has cognitive diminishment that's quite dramatic, but at the same time, they often retain their physical abilities. So they can get away from the house, but they no longer can be reasoned with not to do so. Once you get to late stage, they often lose their ability to even be mobile or ambulatory. Now, in my family's case, we never made it to late stage in the home environment. I suspect that our situation isn't entirely unique in that regard. At the end of middle stage, my dad got to the point where he was too much of a challenge, especially since I had 2 young kids in the house, and we did segue him into a nursing home environment at that point. Our involvement with his care didn't completely end because, of course, we visited him in the nursing home, and I was a part of the family council and several other things besides. But the challenges shifted. They were no longer focused so heavily on in-home care and so on. So if it seems like I'm overly focused on middle stage at various places, both in this presentation and in other videos, that's the reason why. And that will segue into our next section. Supposing that your loved one does not have other conditions that impact their life expectancy, and further supposing that you persist as their caretaker long enough, in late stage you will likely see dramatic changes in your loved one's condition. Whereas in middle stage, speaking abilities are degraded, by late stage, your loved one's speech may become severely impoverished. In fact, they might lose their ability to say anything at all. And obviously, communication is a two-way street. So realize that your loved one will probably become unable to comprehend what you are telling them either. Additionally, whereas they will need help with everyday activities in middle stage, in late stage you will quite possibly have to do most, if not everything, for them by yourself. This includes things such as bathing them, dressing them, feeding them, and so on. And whereas in middle stage, you might spend a whole lot of time policing your loved one's activities, by late stage, you'll pretty much be entirely devoted to tending to their day-to-day needs. We'll revisit some of this in just a few minutes when we talk about physical factors. But in short, late stage represents the culmination of their dementia's progression. For example, they may become incontinent, meaning that they lose control of their bladder and bowel functions. Eventually, your loved one may become completely powerless to move around or walk. In other words, they may be non-ambulatory, bedridden, or wheelchair-bound. Believe it or not, I recently touched on this aspect of things in my video, What Does Aristotle Have to Do with Alzheimer's Disease? Eventually, my dad wasn't able to chew or to swallow his food. An obvious and immediate consequence of this is weight loss. But besides that, these things can also raise your loved one's risk for additional health problems. Inability to swallow properly can lead to aspiration. This is when a person gets food particles or water into their lungs. This can lead to infections like pneumonia and to other serious health complications. Reduced mobility can also raise the probability that they may develop blood clots. These clots can then break loose, resulting in strokes that further worsen their conditions. Still, from the perspective of day-to-day caregiving activities, late stage can sort of calm down, quiet down just a little bit. This is to say that challenges about aggression and elopement may be replaced because the person may have declined to the point where they can no longer get around. However, other challenges certainly present themselves. If you've ever had to pick up somebody off of the ground if they fall, or insert a catheter into someone's body, then you know that these are not pleasant or easy by any definition.
And these practical challenges are only part of the picture.
Consider now what I will call emotional factors, both yours and your loved ones. As previously admitted, I have a tendency to get angry easily. This is part of my internal point of view, and so subjective in that sense. But since, for better or worse, I really am that way, you could also consider it to be an objective part of any care environment where I'm the primary caregiver. But as I previously explained, my sister is not the same way. Therefore, if she had been the caregiver instead of me, you could say that the care environment would have been more mellow, at least from the standpoint of the person delivering care. So just be aware of those kinds of things and be honest with yourself. It's not as though these factors are necessarily going to be reasons to not become a caretaker. I was caretaker anyway. I just had to realize that about myself and then really work to dial that back. But you should also realize that you need to concern yourself to a certain extent with your loved one, with the afflicted loved one's personality, and realize that their personality is likely to change over the time that you're caretaker. Consider again my dad. He was, for most of his life, very good-natured. But as his Alzheimer's progressed, he went from being pleasant to being belligerent and short-tempered. He tended toward being distrustful and suspicious of everyone. He accused me of stealing his belongings. He accused my sons, who were 5 and 7 at the time, of intentionally leaving toys around the house just to confound him. He also became extraordinarily withdrawn. And for most of his life, he had been a social butterfly. Co-workers frequently talked in glowing terms about how affable he was and how easy to get along with he was. He was always willing to go the extra mile, do things for people, that kind of person. When he retired, at first, he kept an active lifestyle. But as his cognitive powers faded, he became more and more isolated. At first, the isolation was self-imposed. Later, it had to be enforced to a certain extent because of the limitations. Once he had his driver's license revoked, for example, he no longer had the option to just get in the car and go somewhere. On his own, anyway. By late stage, he was entirely unable to express emotion. Now, it's an interesting and deep question as to whether or not a person who is in late stage experiences the full range of emotions. That's a much harder question to answer. I'm not taking a position on that in this video. It was obvious that he was unable to express whatever emotions he felt internally. Other Alzheimer's sufferers may experience different emotions, different spectrum. They may experience the same ones to different degrees, and so on. Some emotions may appear from time to time, and others may be more or less continuous. But of course, don't forget our overriding question. Is it hard to be a caretaker? Obviously, it's harder for caretakers in an environment when negative emotional factors predominate, whether their own or that of their afflicted loved ones. And whether negative factors predominate or not is prone to vary. And of course, may vary harkens back not just to personality changes, but to Alzheimer's stages as well. Any prospective caretaker should be prepared for an emotional roller coaster, both in terms of interacting with their afflicted loved ones and, frankly, internally. In early stage Alzheimer's, a lot of the emotional turmoil will swirl around the diagnosis itself. Predictably, there will be lots of fear regarding all of the unknowns. How will the disease progress? How long do we have? Will the afflicted person have to go into a nursing home? What are all our options? And so on. Depression can easily set in. During middle stage, at least some of the emotional difficulties will involve interpersonal clashes, conflicts, and attempts to restrain or restrict your loved one. There can be mutual anger, doubt, and frustration about whether the caregiving situation is sustainable. There can be feelings of hopelessness about the lack of viable or affordable alternatives. And this stage, middle stage, can become a veritable nightmare, especially as far as the care environment goes. In late stage, the caregiver may have a lot of time to reflect on the obvious and severe decline that their loved one has undergone. Of course, this can lead to heavy sorrow. And in saying, as I did earlier, that middle stage is often the most challenging, that by no means implies that late stage is a cakewalk. And it's arguably the most disturbing, especially when you consider it from the point of view of your afflicted loved one. It must feel something like being suffocated or like being stuck in a windowless room or prison cell. And of course, the emotional fallout can afflict anyone involved in this, from the actual dementia sufferer to the caretaker to other people in the house. I mean, my children experienced emotional turmoil just because they were there. They had no role to speak of in the care process, nor were they afflicted, and yet they were affected. So this can apply to any of the above-named emotions: anger, depression, confusion, and so on. But it might also result in emotional exhaustion or feeling overwhelmed, feeling resentful, trapped, etc. Emotional and personality changes track along with the general mental deterioration that is literally constitutive of Alzheimer's disease. Obviously, that's what dementia is. It's cognitive decline. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle termed human beings rational animals. From this standpoint, when our rational faculties are undermined, so in a pertinent and tragic sense, is our very humanity. This isn't a video about the ins and outs of that deterioration process. Suffice it to say here, though, that where your loved one is in his or her cognitive mental decline will obviously bear upon the question of how hard it is to care for them. Alzheimer's and related dementias follow patterns of progression. Thus, the overall contours of the decline are, in a sense, predictable. But your loved one's exact experience will be unique to them in certain respects. And by extension, your experience as a caretaker for them will also be unique. In general, your loved one's forgetfulness will increase. They will go from not remembering where they put the car keys, to not remembering how to safely drive, to not remembering where they live, and even possibly not remembering who they are. Additionally, your loved one may forget who you are. But I should say that in my dad's case, I did frequently have the impression that he retained a spark of recognition for people that he encountered that were close to him. In a particularly poignant example of that, my sister traveled some distance to be at his bedside near the time when he died, and he very remarkably, and to my mind obviously, reacted to her as if he knew her. But since there's no way to ask him or to get a response, and there's no way to objectively measure that, that might have been merely my impression. And in any event, your experience might be quite different. Their sense of place and time are eroded and warped. Frequently, families find that their afflicted loved ones forget their most recent memories first. It's almost as though my dad became a time traveler of a sort, going farther and farther back into the past until he no longer shared the same temporal frame of reference with the rest of us. Initially, bouts of forgetfulness will go side by side with moments of clarity or lucidity. But as middle stage progresses, these periods of lucidity will become few and far between. These mental factors are also bound up with behavioral changes. For example, my formerly laid-back dad became frequently and easily agitated. He was distrustful of others, even paranoid. Sleep often becomes massively disturbed. My dad would frequently nap during the day and then wake at odd and almost certainly inconvenient times of the night. And of course, if your afflicted loved one's sleep is affected, you as the caretaker will find that your sleep is affected as well. An already bad situation is made much worse when you are sleep deprived yourself. An Alzheimer's sufferer's restlessness can motivate wandering. And if the entry doors and other access points are not carefully monitored or restricted, then they might leave the safety of the home environment and become lost. The wandering is also bound up with increasing confusion. Admittedly, many mental factors are not clearly or easily differentiable from emotional factors. They tend to overlap. An example of this might be the fact that an afflicted loved one might tend to experience delusions and hallucinations. They might become paranoid or develop obsessive-compulsive behaviors like nervous hand-wringing. They sometimes hide food or other objects. They may lose their inhibitions and act bizarrely. For example, my dad had a run-in with employees of a local store. We were never able to figure out just quite what had happened, and frankly, we didn't want to look into it too deeply, I guess, out of embarrassment, if nothing else. But it appeared that my dad accused the store of withholding something from him that he thought he was entitled to. It might have been that he thought he should get a free refill of some cleaning fluid for his eyeglasses. Upon being refused, he decided to take matters into his own hands, quite literally, and it looks like he might have shoplifted or attempted to shoplift the item in question, at which point, perhaps, he was simply asked to leave and not come back. Some sufferers may express or experience emotions that are inappropriate for the occasion or for the situation. They may resort to the use of explicit or foul language. Again, once my dad evidently had a grudge with someone. Upon encountering this person at a church service, he screamed an obscenity at them and caused a minor disturbance, to say the least. Relatedly, an Alzheimer's sufferer may feel threatened without warrant, and for their part, they may exacerbate or provoke interpersonal conflicts. So consider the overall picture. There are increased levels of anxiety and fear, disordered sleep, newfound sensitivities to crowds, light, or noise, derangement or overstimulation of the afflicted person's imagination, and all these can conspire to make your loved one even angrier or even more depressed. Frankly, the result can be an uptick in upset and worry for the entire household. Needless to say, all this can put an enormous strain on the caregiver. I have a separate video about the difficulties involved in being a solo caretaker. And all these things inevitably and somewhat confusedly spill over into physical factors. We can round out this part of the discussion by noting that physical degeneration is also part of the caretaking picture. And how hard it is to provide care will, of course, depend on these factors as well. Regardless of the absence or presence of comorbidities, cognitive decline will, in and of itself, destroy dexterity as well as gross and fine motor abilities. Your loved one will probably develop problems bathing or showering by themselves, for example. At first, it may be beneficial and sufficient to have access to a walk-in shower as opposed to a bathtub. If the difficulty is just stepping over and into the bathtub, you can add non-skid pads, you can add grab bars to make the experience a little more manageable. But eventually, you might need to handle or at least oversee the entire washing process yourself. Many other related physical disabilities may surface as well. Here, we can get a bit of insight by thinking about what the health and long-term care industries call the activities of daily living. I outlined these in greater detail in a dedicated video. But usually there are 6 so-called ADLs. The first is bathing by yourself, as mentioned. The other 5 are dressing, feeding, toileting, transferring, as in and out of bed, in and out of a chair, and finally, maintaining continence. Dressing includes, first and foremost, the physical act of putting a garment onto your body. But it also ranges over the mental process of deciding what garment is appropriate. Appropriate for the occasion, appropriate for weather conditions, etc. And an Alzheimer's afflicted person may lose the ability to dress in a manner that is appropriate for the location, occasion, season, weather, and so on. They may wear garments backward or on the wrong part of their body. Similarly, feeding oneself involves not only the physical actions of using utensils, but also the ability to recognize what and how much food is appropriate or inappropriate to consume. In late stage, my dad got so bad that he was unable to chew and even swallow. For more on this, see the video I did on how one actually dies of Alzheimer's. As for toileting, what's really in view is the procedural elements. Disrobing, flushing, wiping, etc. Transferring has to do with moving one's body around. This includes in and out of bed, in and out of chairs, on and off the toilet, etc. Finally, maintaining continence has to do with the ability to control one's own bladder and bowel functions. Other physical effects of Alzheimer's include its negative impact on the 5 senses, which I have covered in greater detail in another video. Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia can also undermine a person's ability to feel hot or to feel cold, or at least undermining their ability to react, recognize, or report the effects of temperature. To a certain extent, when it comes to cognitively impaired adults, the level of caretaking difficulty is inversely proportional to your loved one's mobility. Obviously, caring for a physically disabled adult carries challenges of its own. And it's by no means easy to pick up a grown person off the floor should they fall or slide out of their chair. But the Alzheimer's usually adds layers of difficulty onto this. A physically disabled adult who nevertheless still possesses their reasoning powers, can at least understand that you're trying to help them. Presumably, they may even be counted on to assist you, if they can, or at least not to fight you. But when a person is cognitively impaired, you can't count on anything. In a sense, the more physically capable they are, the more they can resist you, and the more mischief they can get into in terms of elopement or in terms of getting down the power tools or whatever. And that can turn into a real mess. Let me turn for a moment to financial factors. First of all, I have a companion video to this one titled, "Can You Do It All By Yourself?" on the topic of whether it's possible to be a solo caretaker. In that presentation, I took the time to discuss various home financial scenarios in a bit of detail. I considered the possible difference that commuting might make versus working from home, and so on. So here, I want to be a little bit more cursory. When your loved one is in early stage, he or she may not need particularly intensive assistance or around-the-clock supervision. Consequently, if you're still working, it may be possible for you to provide them with minimal assistance while continuing your daily business. The may, of course, has numerous asterisks attached to it. The particulars of your loved one's needs and situation, including whether or not there are any comorbidities or disabilities, will be partially determinative here. But by middle stage, caretaking is almost certainly going to be a full-time occupation. At that point, it will be somewhere in the vicinity of ill-advised, infeasible, or outright practically impossible to go about your pre-caregiving activities and expect to provide an adequate level of help to your afflicted loved one. In fact, to expect to keep them at home, whether it's in your house or theirs, you will probably have to have assistance. And if no assistance is forthcoming on the family front, then you'd have to turn to professional caregivers. Daily paid assistance is pricey. In-home caregivers are available, or I mean that there is such a thing that exists. Whether or not they are available in the sense of being able to be at your house tomorrow is quite another matter. And in this case, some of it will cash out in terms of just run-of-the-mill economics, supply and demand, and so on. Alternatively, you could take your loved one to someplace like an adult daycare. Both options, both hiring somebody to come into the house and taking your loved one to an adult daycare, might cost several thousand a month. But even so, these price points are less expensive than what you would expect to pay to have them in a nursing home 24/7. Of course, there are complications. Adult daycares run the gamut. On the one hand, less expensive varieties may not be equipped to provide care for people with more than mild cognitive impairment. Some adult daycares may cater to families with loved ones who have more severe forms of dementia. Necessarily, these places would have to have staff with specialized training. They may require secure facilities and so on, and all of that usually comes with higher associated costs. If you or your loved one, or both, are receiving government assistance, you should consider how combining households might impact dollar amounts or eligibility for certain programs. And be sure to consult experts if there is any possibility that Medicaid would be required at some point. For an introduction to that complicated program, see my past videos. If you have some form of stable passive income, then your financial situation might be less worrisome. But of course, it's debatable just how passive various forms of passive income actually are. If you are truly fully retired and have some sufficient monthly paycheck, for example, from some kind of guaranteed pension, then you may be on safer footing. However, these days, many retirements end up being partial or hybrid affairs, where a modest Social Security benefit, for example, must be supplemented with income from something like a part-time job. Additionally, if you're counting on distributions from a retirement account or dividends from a stock portfolio, then you may need to keep a weather eye on the market. Or you might find that the next downturn or recession wrecks not only your retirement plans, but your caregiving plans as well. And that certainly happened in the case of my dad's retirement, and it also affected our caregiving picture. In my dad's case, after major economic crashes, circa 2001 and 2008, his retirement income was essentially reduced to his Social Security check. That check, incidentally, went to the nursing home as part of his Medicaid income spend down once we had to go that route. Households have so many variations here, I couldn't possibly list them all even if I tried. So I'll just conclude this section with a few more scattered thoughts. If your family's working with more than one person's income, say you and your spouse, and you're caring for, say, one of your parents, you may have smoother sailing from the financial point of view. A final word, and I touched on this in my solo caregiving video as well, don't just assume that you will have free and unfettered access to your afflicted loved one's funds. Firstly, Medicaid is very particular about the handling of assets and income. As mentioned, if it's even remotely possible that your loved one might eventually need government assistance to afford professional long-term care, then you have to tread carefully with any financial moves. See my past videos for an introduction, and consult an expert for actual advice. Secondly, banks and other financial institutions have numerous regulatory and reporting protocols aimed at finding and preventing elder abuse. Of course, this is not to say that you have any nefarious intentions, but I'm simply pointing out that various contemplated financial moves may have to be explained to your loved one's money managers and other financial consultants. And of course, your loved one would have to give consent. If they are no longer competent or lucid enough to give consent, and you do not already have a trust or a durable or springing power of attorney in place, then your only recourse may be to petition a court for conservatorship. This is not the place to tease out the ins and outs of that process. I have touched on this in other videos. Suffice it to say that a court-appointed conservator has many limitations, or at least it's possible they might have limitations and restrictions on the kinds of changes they can make to their ward's finances, and conservators must report to the court on their management of all relevant funds. Up to now, one of the primary thrusts of the Alzheimer's Proof project has been on making small modifications to the home to make it friendlier, safer, and more usable as a care environment. In fact, that's one of the meanings that I intended to convey by this channel's titular phrase, Alzheimer's proofing. In my view, Alzheimer's proofing is a close cousin to baby proofing or child proofing. In both cases, you're making the home safe for somebody you're going to have to care for. Given that, I have put a lot of energy into other videos giving examples of, and sometimes how-tos on, these kinds of changes. And given that every home situation will require different alterations, I won't spend a lot of time on this one presently, but see my library videos for more information. And please don't hesitate to leave comments if there's some aspect of Alzheimer's proofing that you'd like to see me cover. What I will say here will be in line with the overall current discussion. How hard is it to be a caretaker? Well, part of the answer has to do with how reliable a care environment you have access to. How safe and secure is your home? Put another way, how much Alzheimer's proofing have you done? And the point is, you will almost certainly have to do some. To a certain extent, a few modifications might correspond with those that might be necessary for any aging adult. This might include installing grab bars and handrails, adding non-slip flooring, widening doors to accommodate wheelchairs, putting in wheelchair ramps at the entryways, converting bathtubs into walk-in showers, adding light flashers to carbon monoxide and smoke alarms for the hearing impaired, adding additional lighting to minimize fall risk, and so on. Some long-term care insurance policies may provide a nominal dollar amount for home care improvements such as these. In many cases, however, you'll have to foot the bill yourself. And other, more customized modifications may be unique to those situations in which a member of the household is suffering from dementia. These kinds of modifications might include adding bed rails or a bed alarm, hanging noise-canceling materials to walls of an interior room, changing or reversing door locks to discourage elopement, adding closing mechanisms or locks to outdoor gates, installing cabinet locks in bathrooms and kitchens, securing ovens and refrigerators, putting in closed-circuit TV cameras or other monitoring devices, camouflaging or restricting thermostats, gating or otherwise securing basement, garage, or other potentially hazardous access points, etc. How hard these will be for you depends on many factors. For example, which of the changes are necessary in your case? How much personal know-how do you have or do other family members have to be able to execute these kinds of changes themselves? How much money do you have available in order to buy the necessary equipment, or if you do not have the skill set, to hire people to make the changes for you? I don't want this video to be a downer. Dementia and the other problems that arise in day-to-day caretaking are challenging enough. And I fully realize that some of you, even many of you, are not in a position where you can just sit back and weigh the pros and cons of becoming a caretaker. You might just find yourself thrown headlong into a caretaking role. It's not like you're making a major purchase like buying a car and you can just say, you know what, I'm going to wait. It's possible that, as far as you can see, there is no decision making at all. It's just a fact on the ground. This is partly why I have been at pains to direct you back to some of my other videos. Because my Alzheimer's proofing project, if it's anything, is partly designed as a how-to guide. It's partly aimed at helping you cope the best you can with a home caretaking role. Especially, though not exclusively, by making necessary changes around the house, the Alzheimer's proofing. But all that said, I still think there's room for and value in self-reflection. And even if, at the end of the day, this doesn't bottom out in an ability to opt in or opt out of the caretaking role, I still think that you can get benefit out of managing your expectations. This is because if you think caretaking is just going to be easy, it's going to be a cakewalk, as I initially did, in fact, and you encounter even the slightest amount of adversity, that can completely deflate your confidence, deflate your enthusiasm, and basically torpedo your entire project. Even a tiny bit of hardship might seem devastating and intolerable. On the other hand, if you expect it to be more difficult, then you're either mentally prepared when challenges arise, or you're pleasantly surprised when they don't. I suppose in this respect, it can be a bit like the old adage, expect the worst and you'll never be disappointed. So is there no place for optimism as a caretaker? And I think this is a serious and difficult question. In the first place, there's a distinction between being hopeful and being naive. Given the current state of treatments and enough time, your loved one's Alzheimer's will become worse. And so in a sense, I guess it depends on what you're hoping or trusting in. If you're hoping for medical science to swoop in and save the day for your loved one and your family, you're probably going to be disappointed. Of course, various faith perspectives can play a major role here. And on this wavelength, a person might trust in God, trust in some higher power, trust in their guardian angel. Now, the variety of perspectives is so varied, and the subject is so deep, that I can only gesture towards it here. But let me know in the comments if exploring some of those topics would be of interest. I certainly wouldn't want my approach to be divisive. That's not the aim of this channel. So for today, let me sign off by simply drawing a contrast between two basic things: putting trust in your loved one and putting trust in your care plan. I think very frequently people are just simply thrust into a caregiving role and they haven't adequately planned for it. You take on caretaking duties, but you're not prepared. I know that was the case for me. And sometimes this is unavoidable, as we've said. If you wake up one day and your spouse has a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or some other form of dementia, it's not like you can bow out of the relationship, nor would you want to. At least you wouldn't want to when you're more reflective. And so the point really is to remember why you're doing what you're doing. Remember your loved one for the person that they were, even if in day-to-day dealings with them, they start to behave less and less like the person you love and the person you remember. So by putting your trust in your loved one, I partly mean trust in the fact that you are doing this for their benefit, you're trying to do right by them, and in fact, to a certain degree, it's putting trust in yourself. On the other hand, there's a lot of value in trying to coordinate with and get advice from trusted advisors. And again, that's another function of the Alzheimer's Proof Project, is to try to deliver to you quality materials that can help you to get a care plan in place to make these home caretaking responsibilities more manageable. And at the end of the day, I hope that you can develop such a plan and then be able to trust in the plan, with the caveat that you may need to adjust the sails as things change, and they certainly will change when it comes to caretaking. Things will come up, things might happen to you, things might happen in your extended family that make caretaking difficult or impossible. And at that point, you may have to make very hard decisions like, when is it time for a nursing home? Or do I have to bring in third-party professional services? Are there family members who can help you? And I have additional videos, both already published and planned, exploring some of these different angles. But if you found something of interest in this video, I know it was somewhat freeform at times, then I ask you that you would click the like button. Please subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see additional content or check back. If you know somebody else who might benefit from the content, I ask you to share the original link with them. And please share your experiences with me in the comments, share your feedback, hopefully politely, and I hope to see you again in another video. Thank you so much for watching.